Hi, I'm Sarah and I'm an artist in Lake. In this tutorial, I'm going to walk you through a few colour theory tips along with a quick demonstration to help you level up your colouring skills. So let's dive in. Before we start colouring an image, I want to go over some basic colour theory tips with you, which will help you know what to look out for when choosing your colours. So let's start by defining the three variables that make up a colour, those being hue, value and saturation. So when we talk about hue, we're talking about the colour itself. So for example, red, yellow, green, blue, pink, and any of those in between. And we can visualise our hues on a wheel ranging from our warm tones to our cool tones and back round again. If you head to the rainbow palette on your toolbar below, you can shift between hues by just sliding across on that wheel. And you can think about your hues in terms of warm tones and cool tones. And then when we talk about value, we're talking about how light or dark a colour is. So values range from white at the lightest and all the way through different tonal values until we get to black at our darkest value. And again, looking at this rainbow colour wheel, if you want to change the value of a colour, you can just slide down on any particular hue and that will darken your colours, and if you slide back up, that will lighten your colours. And then finally we have saturation. So saturation refers to how vibrant your colour is, ranging from completely desaturated, which is just a grey tone, and then as we increase the saturation, the colour becomes much more vibrant and bright until it reaches its most saturated form. So if you want to change the saturation of your colours within the rainbow wheel, you can tap within this semicircle here and that will change between sunny, rainy and cloudy. So sunny is very bright and saturated, rainy is very desaturated pastel tones, and cloudy is somewhere in between the two. So this rainbow wheel allows us to change between hue, value and saturation really easily. But if you want more flexibility with your colours, you can click within this white outline circle and you'll see this multicoloured disc come up. So you can change the hue and saturation of your colour by moving around within the disc here, and then you can change the value by moving this slider at the top of the disc here. So that allows for a lot of extra flexibility and just gives you a different way of choosing colours within Lake. So when working with these variables and colour in general, it helps to think in terms of high contrast versus low contrast. So we want to use high contrast in areas that we want to draw attention to, for example, characters, and low contrast in areas that we want to draw less attention to, for example, backgrounds. So I'm just going to give you some quick examples of high contrast versus low contrast when choosing colours. I'd say when we're thinking about contrast and colours in general, value is the most important aspect to consider. We want to make sure we use a wide range of shades between our lights and darks and midtones to help our piece stand out and be readable. So for example, when we're creating a high contrast, we want to leave quite a range between our lights and darks. So I'm choosing that light grey and this very dark black. And that will create a very high contrast. And then if I use that same light grey again, but this time, because I want to create a lower contrast, I'll use a tone that is more similar to that light grey. So you can see between these two examples, the high contrast stands out and grabs our attention much more than the low contrast, which is much calmer and easier on the eyes. And the exact same concept applies whether you're working with desaturated grey tones or something with more colour. So as well as creating contrast with value, we can think about creating contrast between hues as well. So to create a high contrast with our hues, we want to use colours that are quite far apart from each other on the colour wheel. So if we wanted a colour that contrasts well with the red, we can use any of the colours that are opposite that red on the colour wheel. So for this example, I'll pick that colour that's very opposite from the red, and you can see that creates a very strong contrast. And now if we want to create a low contrast to the red, I can pick something that's very close to the red in hue, so maybe a pink or an orange, and you can see that that feels much calmer on the eye. And we can do the same thing with any other colour. So if I want to create a high contrast with this blue, then I can choose that colour opposite, which is the yellow. And if I want to create a low contrast, I can choose any of these adjacent colours. So with saturation, our most saturated colours are going to contrast much more with each other compared to their desaturated counterparts. So you can see that when the saturation level is totally desaturated, these are just shades of grey, so they have a very low contrast to each other compared to the very saturated colours. So if we want to create a high contrast, we can place our saturated colours together, and if we want to create a low contrast, we can desaturate those colours quite a lot. So that's why pastel scenes feel much more calm compared to very vibrant and saturated palettes. And you can see that if we compare these two columns, the high contrast grabs our attention and stands out a lot more compared to the low contrast colours. So now that we've covered these basics, I'm going to put this theory into practice and show you how I colour my art in Lake. So I'm going to be using the rainbow colour wheel to demonstrate, but if you feel overwhelmed with choices, I recommend using one of the pre-made palettes available in Lake. So I like to start off by first of all considering the subject and thinking about the feeling that I want to create. So here we have a forest scene. So I know that I want to use a lot of different shades of green and create variation there. There's also a little bit of sky here, so I might want to include some vibrant sunset colours and add some warmth in there. And we also have this river, which I think will be reflecting the sky colour. And then we have our main character, which will be the focal point of the image. So because I want to use lots of green in the background, I can choose a colour for the character that will stand out nicely against the green and create a lot of contrast to grab the eye. So let's start by choosing a colour for the focal point. So I'm going to choose something quite saturated to begin with, and I'm just using the bucket tool for speed here. So I'm just playing around with a few things to begin with before I decide on any one colour. So I think that is quite nice to start with, and then if I want to make that little girl character stand out on the bird, then I can use something that contrasts nicely with the pink. So I can start to bring in some green here as a complementary colour to the pink. And I can contrast that green with orange and think about varying my values between light and dark and using different amounts of saturation, swapping between the cloudy, sunny and rainy versions of the colour wheel. So I am just trying out different colours here and seeing what happens and seeing what I like best. So I think this works quite nicely so far, and if I want to redo anything, I can go back into it after I've put the background in. But I want to start putting some of these greens in the background now. So I'm heading to that section on the colour wheel, and I'll maybe head to the cloudy rainbow wheel and just start blocking in some greens. So I want to kind of keep shifting the hue between cooler greens and warmer greens, and I'm also shifting between different values of green just to add a lot of variation and interest to the background, but still keeping it low contrast compared to the focal point. So something else to keep in mind when we're working with a landscape scene or any scene that you want to add depth to is that any elements in the foreground are going to be much higher contrast than elements that are further away. So we're going to have a stronger contrast between lights and darks. So I'm just adding in some darker colours for these trees in the foreground to add a bit of depth. And then I will continue to add in different colours for the midground and keeping them more in mid-tone values compared to the trees in the front. Something else that happens when you have a landscape scene and you want to create depth is that any of the elements that are further away from you will shift more towards the colour of the sky. So if, for example, I have a blue sky, the hills will shift more towards a blue tone. But if I want to use a warmer colour for the sky, like sunset colours, then those greens will shift more towards yellow as they move closer to the sky. So I'm going to keep that warmer colour for now, and I'm going to have those greens shifting closer towards the yellow tone as they move further into the distance. And they'll also become lighter as they recede into the background. So I'm actually adding more cool tones of green as the depth shifts forward and away from the sunlight. So now I think we have quite a nice contrast here with the red standing out against the green, and I want to bring that red colour into the sun as well. So I'm going to colour pick that colour and I'm just going to drop it in to the sun there. And I want these clouds to be a warm colour as well, but maybe a little less saturated than that bright red so that they don't distract too much. So I think this pink works quite nicely. And then I can bring that pink into some other elements of the scene and maybe also into the character as well. And that just helps to tie everything in nicely and create a little bit more contrast with the pink versus the green, and helps to create some cohesiveness within the overall scene. So now I'm going to add some lighting effects. So I'm going to first of all add a gradient into the sky and the river. So I'm going to use the watercolour brush and choose a very desaturated pale light yellow colour. I'll make sure I have quite a large brush selected, and then I'll just paint over a little gradient in the river and the sky. And that just helps to add a bit more brightness and interest to those large areas. Finally, I'm going to add some simple highlights and shading to polish off the image and add some final depth, dimension and contrast in certain areas that I want to stand out. So I'm using the pencil tool set to that pale light yellow, and I'm just going to draw along the edge of my focal point where the light would be hitting. So in this image I have a clear light source, which is the sun. So I'm just drawing that highlight along the front edge of that character where the sun would be hitting. So if you don't have a clear light source in your image, but you want to add a highlight, then you can always just make one up. But make sure you stay consistent with which direction the light would be coming from. So I'll add highlights to these trees in the foreground to help create a bit more depth there as well, and add more contrast to these trees which are close to us. So again, I'm just drawing that highlight along the edge of these trees where the sun would be hitting them, and that just helps them to stand out a little bit more. And I'm also going to add a highlight to these tree trunks and also to these rocks. And then I can also add very subtle highlights in the distance. And one last thing that I can do if I want to add even more dimension is to add a shadow. So to add a shadow, I like to pick the colour of the element I want to add a shadow to, and then I want to move the hue closer to a cooler colour and darken the value slightly. And then I can draw the shadow on the opposite side to where the highlight is. So there you go, that is how I colour my artwork in Lake. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and I wish you lots of fun on your colouring journey.